In the third video from this module, we will continue with our healthcare clinic example that we ended with last time. And our main objective in this video is to look at combining the the individual sequence tables into a single sequence table. Note that this is going to involve using a couple of more advanced features of Simio tables, and we're just going to scratch the surface today, or in this video, and in a future video we will cover the use of tables much more comprehensively. So recall that we ended up with this model. We had put the walking people in for the last step, and the entity types, or the patient types, were controlled. The sequence was controlled through entity sequences. And so in particular, if you look at walk-in patients, they go from registration to triage, treatment, accounting, and sync. And so we implemented that by defining a sequence table called walk-in sequence, and then assigning that sequence to the entity type. And when the entity was created, it then inherited, or it had that sequence type when it was created, and it followed that processing sequence. To get started with our task, we're going to go to our data and our table section where we have our sequence tables, and I'm going to define two new tables. So the first one I'm going to add is just a data table, which I'm going to call patient types. And when we created the sequence table, what Simio did is it just created a table and then added a node column. That's in fact what a sequence is just a table with a column specifying the nodes. But we want a general data table, and the first thing we're going to do in our patient type is add our columns. And so the first column that I want to add is an object reference, and we'll see why we want to do this in a second. And I'm going to add the entity instance, or add the object reference, and then name this column patient type. So we've created a patient type table, a patient types table with a single column that is an entity property called patient type. And because I have the object table, entity type, I can simply select from the patient types that have been defined within our model. So we want to do walk-in patients, lab patients, EKG patients, X-ray patients, and MRI patients. And so we now have a table that has 5 rows and column for the patient type. So the next step that I have to do is define patient type as something called a key column. So I just click on set column as key, and it says this particular column of this table, happens to be the only column for the time being, is the key column for the table. So now that we have the patient type table, the next step is to define our single sequence table. So I will click on add a sequence table, and let's just name this sequences. And instead of just filling in the nodes like we did before, I need to add a reference back to the patient type table. So I'm going to go to sequences and add a foreign key, and I'm just going to move this column over to the right. You don't have to do that, but it's just convention. And I'm going to name this reference patient type. And the reference then says what is the table key that you want to use, because we're setting up a foreign key. So I only have one foreign key, or one key column, and that's the patient type from the patient types table. And so now when we click on patient type in our table, we see the list of records that were in the patient types table. So I want to fill in the sequences, and the way we do this is we select the patient type, and then we just input the sequence like we did before. So I have walk-in patients go to registration, then walk-in patients go to triage, then walk-in patients go to treatment, then walk-in patients go to accounting, then walk-in patients leave. And so you can see we have just replicated the values in our walk-in sequence table in our sequences table, which is connected to the patient type table through this foreign key. So now we will put the lab patients, and the lab patients start out at the lab, and then the lab patients go to accounting, and then the lab patients exit. X-ray patients start at registration. X-ray patients then go to the X-ray, and X-ray patients then go to accounting, and finally X-ray patients depart. MRI patients start out at registration, so we go to registration. MRI patients then go to MRI. MRI patients then go to accounting, and MRI patients then depart. And finally we have our EKG patients. So EKG patients start out at registration. They then go to EKG. They then go to accounting. And finally they leave. Go to the sync. And so you can see what we have done is we have replicated the individual walk-in lab, X-ray, MRI sequence, EKG sequence tables in our single table called sequences, which is then separated by patient type, and patient type column is a foreign key to the patient type table. Also, when we go back to the patient type tables, we now see what's called master detail view, because there's a relationship, a defined relationship between patient types and sequences. We see the little plus here that we can expand, and now we can see the sequence specifically for the walk-in patients. And if we expand, say, the X-ray patients, we then see the sequence specifically for the X-ray patient. And so this relationship between the patient type table and the sequences table connects the table so that when we specify a row in the patient type table, it then connects directly to the corresponding rows in the sequences table. So now that I have my patient type table and my sequences table, I no longer need these individual tables. And note first that I had gone back and I had nullified the initial sequences. So walk-in patients initial sequence, lab patients, X-ray patients, and so on. And so now I can go back and delete these individual tables because I no longer need them. And I can now focus on my patient type table and my sequences table. Then I go back to my facility view, and also note that I had deleted the remaining sources because I only want to create from a single source. I forgot to show that, but I had deleted the other sources, and so now we just have our initial source that we use to create the walk-in patient. And what we want to do is we want the source to then use the patient types rows to select a patient type, and then the relationship to the sequences to specify the sequence. So to do that, we are going to use the probabilities for individual types. So I took our static model, which has arrivals at the rate of 43 per hour, and I computed these individual proportion of this total 43. So I took the 10 per hour divided by 43, and so 23.3% of the 43 patients that arrive per hour are of type walk-in. 46.5% of the 43 patients per hour that arrive are of type lab. So now I want to use my single source object to create entities according to those given proportions. So I'm going to go back to my data table and my patient type table, and I'm going to add a new property, a real type property, and I'm going to call this mix. So this is going to be our patient mix, and I'm going to put in those proportion values that we saw. So 23.3 for walk-in patients, 46.5 for lab patients, 11.6 for X-ray patients, 14 for MRI patients, and finally 4.7 for EKG patients. So let's make sure we have those right. So 23.3 for walk-in, 46.5 for lab, 4.7 for EKG, 11.6 for X-ray, and 14 for MRI. And so now we have a mix column which specifies the proportion, and we will use a feature in to connect the entities that are created to our patient types table and to generate random rows according to this patient mix. So to do that, I'll go back to the source and table assignments, and before creating entities, I want to create a connection to that table. So I have patient types tables, and it's saying, okay, before I create the entity, I want to create this connection. Which row do I want to use? So I'm going to use the expression patient types mix random row. And so that tells Simio when a entity is about to be created, go to the patient types table, the mix column, and pick a random row from the table using the specified mix. And so it uses the similar calculation, or the same calculation as we saw when we had multiple links emanating from a node, and we use the selection weight. So Simio will take the individual values, so 23.3 divided by the sum of all the values to calculate the proportion, and then it will generate according to that probability. And because now the entity has a reference to the table, we can use that table to specify the entity type. So I will do patient types, patient type. And so we see that the green arrow here indicates that we have a reference, and so now the entity type will be specified by this column. So when an entity is created, Simio will select a random row from the patient type table. It will then create an entity of the type specified in the patient types column, and because the patient column, because the patient types column is related to the sequences table, the entities now have a sequence that's specified through the relationship with the patient type table. And finally, we need to set the inter-arrival time. Since we have combined the all of the individual sources into a single source, we need to create entities at the rate of 43 per hour. So I'm going to go back and set my inter-arrival time. I don't know what 1 divided by 43 is, so I will just let Simio calculate that for me. And I need to make sure and change the time units to hours. I could have just as easily put 60 over 43, but we'll use the time unit feature here. And so now I have increased my arrival rate, and they should arrive at 43 per hour. And so now when I run the model, let me increase the speed a little bit, we should see entities of different types being created and following their sequence, similar to what we saw before, except having individual sources. We now have a single source that generates at the rate of 43 per hour, and the data connection, the connection to the patient type table, and because the patient type table is related to the sequences table, the entities now follow that sequence. So it looks good so far, so we will stop our interactive run and let's go and run our experiment. And so I don't want to run for the 2,000 hours that we did before. Let's cut this down and run for 500 hours, and let's just run a 100-hour warm up for our 20 replications. And so we click run and let the experiment run. And so we've now completed our run, and we will go to the pivot grid, and then we can compare that with what we expected from our static model. And you can see that the numbers are roughly in line as they were before. So 76, 76, triage is 83 versus 83, treatment is 87.5 versus 87.258, lab is 83.3 versus 83.5, x-ray is 83.3 versus, where is x-ray? X-ray 83.7, MRI is 90 versus 90.34, EKG is 83.3 versus 83.5, and finally counting is 89.6 versus 89.6. So as we expected, our model still results in is in the same results for our verification runs. And so let's recap the difference between the model that we did previously and this one. And so in this model, we have a single sequences table and a related patient type table. So the patient type table has one row for each one of our entity types, our patient types, and we relate those two tables using the patient type column. So it's the key column for the patient type table. It's a foreign key for the sequences table, and that creates the relationship between the table. Then in the source object, when we create an entity, we create a reference to the patient type table, and that reference is attached to the created entity realization. And so because the entity is related to the patient type table, it then has access to the sequences table, and in the transfer nodes, the by sequence statement will cause Simio to look in the sequences table to decide how to route the entity. And so using this related tables is a very powerful way to create data relationships, and in this case we simply used it so that we could have a single table to specify the sequences, and so that we could create multiple entity types from the single source where each one of the entity types had their individual sequence.